Welcome to Disambiguation. I'm your host, Michael Fauscette. Each week, we interview experts in artificial intelligence, generative AI, and business automation to help business leaders understand how to use these tools for the biggest business impact. Our show today is the intelligence model, why your organization needs a map before it deploys AI. I'm joined by Minyang Jiang, Chief Strategy and Revenue Officer at Credibly. Welcome, MJ.
Hi, nice to meet you. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, glad to bring you on. I think this is going to be a really interesting conversation. Kate, can you get us started a little bit by just telling us something about yourself? Tell us a bit about Credibly. I know you've had as we prep for this, you told me a little bit about your story, and I think it's a really interesting one, from Ford Motor Company to founding Go Ride Health, and now strategy, in Gen AI transformation at a Fintech lending company. So how did that path come together, and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I think with most leaders, right, you look backwards and there's a narrative, and but when you're actually doing it, it's just about taking the step that allows you to learn the most. So after I finished business school, I joined Ford Motor Company. I was part of their marketing program, and I did a lot of, product launches and consumer launches, learned a lot about cars. I wasn't a car enthusiast. And then as Ford was transitioning into new business models, working on mobility, I became one of the first startups within Ford, which was the Go Ride Health startup, which focused on medical transportation. And what that really taught me was just sort of finding my place in these organizations where I'm looking a lot at sort of new business models, change management, being able to introduce things that are disruptive and somewhat uncomfortable to core business practices. And so Go Ride, as part of the mobility service, enabled me to do that. And eventually in 2019, I left Ford to essentially do my own startup, which married very well with the beginning of the pandemic, which is to say it did not. So that was a great lesson, a great exercise in humility and failure. And then I was able to join Credibly. The CFO at Credibly also used to work in corporate strategy at Ford, and he and I were very close. He's one of the strongest leaders. So I joined their marketing team, and I was ran marketing, ran sales, but very quickly saw, as ChatGPT came on the scene, 3.5 years ago, that this was an opportunity for us to really transform the business, again, as I had been thinking about it at Ford. And so right now I lead the Gen AI transformation. I also run the innovation team within Credibly, which is the Skunkworks team, which is responsible for a lot of the pushing boundaries of automation, not your core automation, but sort of taking some risks and bringing people together to invent new practices and new processes. So that's what I do, and I love it. And I'm super excited to hear to talk about anything and everything related to AI.
Good. No, that's very interesting. And I, you are right. If you look backwards, it is easier to put together a narrative than it is when you live it. So, you said you're a big believer in tech's ability to help enable humans to be more, if we're thoughtful with it, right? So that's a nuanced position in a market that, let's be honest, has been kind of extreme over the last few years, especially, people claiming that AGI is already here, or it's, on one end, and then on the other end, people claiming there's no ROI for AI. I mean, what do you think the reality is, right now for most businesses?
Yeah, and I was just having a conversation right before even our recording, talking about this to our CEO, because I'm about to lead another executive session around AI in the company. And the reality is, it's building AI on top of existing businesses and workflows is just extremely difficult. I've been in classes with really large companies. I have been with smaller companies, and it's just difficult for many reasons, right? One is that you already have an existing tech stack. And so a lot of the architecture, a lot of the data, a lot of the talent, and even the culture, I would say, is built in such a way where it's not super easy, even if you're really enthusiastic, to adopt AI in a way that's systematic and accurate. And I say those two things because that's what enterprise want. They want system level change, and they want that change to be positive and to not create liability or additional problems for the company. scattered, innovative, small projects that are like very sort of with no real scale and sort of making individuals work more efficient, or things that are creative and interesting but don't require system level change or a high level of accuracy, I think many AI first companies have been able to adopt that. But unless you are a startup, which essentially you're building, without an ecosystem and you exist in a vacuum, when you're a real business and you have a core business you need to run and you have real margins that you need to protect, and you're still trying to build new technology into existing workflows, which means you have to make the workflows sort of AI compatible, which means you have to change those workflows. So those workflows have to be backwards compatible to the core business, and also compatible with this new technology, which I think where most companies are finding that they're stalling, because that's a lot of tech management, people management, cultural changes, and also making sure that you understand decision-making mechanisms and objectives in the company, which AI challenges and is very difficult. So that's where I think most businesses are at. I think there's a lot of will and there's a lot of excitement and there's a lot of low-level experimentation, but system-level change I have not seen in real practice with real businesses that are operating a core business. Yeah. People are able to do it, but it's difficult.
Yeah, I mean that's I've seen that a lot over the last couple of years, especially with talking to companies that are they've done a proof of concept and that worked really well, but then you try to roll that out and it tends to fall apart because like you say you're just trying to fit something on top of something else that you haven't really re-architected or constructed around the right way to actually utilize that as you go forward.
Correct.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, one of the concepts you talked about was the need for an intelligence model, a map of how work and decision making, actually traverses through the organization, before you deploy AI. And most companies, they don't really have that. Can you walk us through, what an intelligence model looks like and, why is it so important to get right before you start with the automation piece?
Yeah, and I've been thinking a lot about this because obviously I don't think Credibly had one either, right? This is one of those things where you kind of stumble into it. So what most companies start is they try to figure out what are best AI use cases, and then we have most companies develop an opinion around that. And though those opinions change very rapidly over time because the models are changing. The frontier models are developing now once every 6 months, 12 months, not once every 2 to 3 years like they used to. So in the beginning, it was like, oh, we can use AI to create chatbots that are, customer facing. And we can use it to draft emails and press releases and graphic design and build websites. And now you're looking at things like, oh, we can use it to do high volume data analysis, and we can use it for all these things. So what happens is without an intelligence model, your use cases shift really quickly and you see a lot of opportunity. You also see a lot of downsides, but you don't know why, right? There is no real framework or anchor to say, hey, here's kind of how we can think about binning these use cases and the risk that come with it. And I'll talk about risk later. So when I took a Wharton class, one of the things, an executive MBA class, one of the things that really helped me understand is kind of think about the core concepts of intelligence. So there's 4 areas, right, which humans are better at, and AI tends to be better at one end of the spectrum, and humans tend to be better at the other end of the spectrum. And then there's sort of hybrid models in between. The first is, I think we all know this, data extraction and analysis. So the ability to consume, interpret, and analyze large quantities of data, AI is extremely good at it. There's some debate about can it extract the file that I gave it? Because we still struggle with that even on the frontier models. But assuming it can get to the right content, summarization, analysis, providing alternate points of view, brainstorming, helping you develop strategy, that is all really good use cases. Deep research, market research, right? Because humans just simply cannot consume this much information, synthesize it quickly, and present it back in a digestible form. So examples of that would be things like, if you build rules around certain types of, say, scoring or whatever, or segmentation, those are built around principles of scarcity. And I will talk about that later, because that's actually one thing AI doesn't do very well, which I think makes us less efficient. We build around what the human brain can process. So if I can understand 3 or 4 rules in the process of, say, underwriting, or in the process of like understanding what cash flow or other types of medical things look like, we build entire bodies of knowledge and decision-making around the limits of what humans can process. Those processes have now been unconstrained. So we no longer have those bottlenecks in terms of consuming, organizing data, and extracting insights from data. All of that is now better with AI and potentially AI human hybrid processes. Yeah. However, what humans are better at, and I will continue to argue that humans are better at this, even though sometimes with the complement efforts of working and iterating with AI, humans are better at prioritizing and decisioning. Right. So especially when you're an expert, the understanding of like, these things are more important in the context of your business, in the context of your organization, your culture, your customers, those things AI is not good at, unless you really train the model on like very specific things. And even then I would argue like branding, emotion, those things are just, there's intuitive senses, the human connection. And then being able to prioritize and then make decisions off of that, I believe there has to be a human component, at least at this point in time. And this is something where when you look at the work flow within an organization, there are a couple of challenges. One is already, I think workflows within organizations and decision-making mechanisms are often unclear. Right? There's politics, there's leadership, there's personalities. So to not have a great map of that, which most organizations don't, presents a challenge as to what are the best use cases for AI. So having a good intelligence model that helps you understand how decisions are being made, where decisions are being made, that's going to be important. And the second thing is, like I said, with respect to the concept of like, where the scarcity models are, right? Where are your bottlenecks? And are those bottlenecks built intentionally? Are you building bottlenecks because your people are constrained and your knowledge base is constrained? Are you bottlenecked because of the lack of certain kinds of expertise? Those are questions that organizations, when they're thinking about deploying AI, having a general framework of what kind of work is happening where, and what are the constraints, and what is the true value of this work? Is it data extraction and analysis? In which case, I think you should push as far as you can with AI tools. Is it decisioning and prioritization? Okay, then there's a different kind of scarcity of intelligence that's in place. And maybe that's more of a hybrid where you're iterating with AI, for example, on your business strategy. I just did this exercise the other day with Claude, where I was working with it on setting up an executive strategy session. I was like, I have an idea I wanted to go. I need you to create some exercises. No, I don't like this one. Here's how it doesn't stitch together. So we iterated on this like 4, 5, 6, 7 times. It's still a time save for me because I couldn't have come up with it myself. But I would never give that whole template to AI and say, you come up with this, because it would just not be as good. It's missing the context, the understanding, the personalities I'm dealing with. So that is when I think like really understanding the nature of the intelligence that the work requires can help people make better decisions.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I use Claude Cowork a lot for research, and when I'm developing ideas and then get ready to publish, and that's the relationship that I have now with it's this interactive relationship that says, look, I have this thesis, I have this data that I think leads here. Can you put that in the right context? Does this work? Throw stones at this and tell me where I'm wrong. Those and that iteration, it does save me a ton of time. But also the result, the hybrid result, is so much better than either result by itself would be.
Yeah, there's actually been some really good studies that have shown that human AI collaborations are still generate the best results in terms of both diverse ideas and quality of ideas. When you just rely on AI over time, it just starts to shrink. Like everything kind of looks the same because it's the same kind of creativity. It's the same kind of imagination, right? Whereas like without that human input, you don't get that extra push. So I completely agree with you. And I think when you work with AI, when it feels really good and feels really natural, is when you're working with someone who is extremely intelligent and you can sort of go back and forth with that person as a thought partner, but it doesn't mean that they're the leader in those circumstances.
Right.
And if you, in fact, I would argue if you make them into the leader, then it won't be as powerful.
Yeah, that really does resonate with me. I think I see that more and more as I use the tools for lots of different tasks. And I hear that I hear the narrative of, oh well, if you have AI do this, it always is the same. I mean, I'd argue that in some cases you'd see that with human work too, right? If you just do something on your own the same way all the time, it does also sort of sound the same. So having ways to brainstorm and work together and collaborate changes the output, whether it's human to human or human to agent.
Absolutely.
Interesting. One of the things you mentioned in there, and I did some work on this a while ago around decisions and how organizations make decisions, and that strikes me as a really interesting point too. When you think about complex organizations, and if you're just going to come in and say, oh, we're going to automate this decision making, that could be really difficult, because even just defining that in a company can be nearly impossible, if you don't spend a lot of time really trying to break it down.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that we're seeing recently, and I remember just posting about it to like an AI chat group, is it's actually quite inefficient right now in a way to work with AI and especially AI agents, because I think there's this beautiful future where everything is really automated. AI really know, your agents know your preferences. You've communicated what you wanted. It can make these great decisions that optimize on your behalf. We're in a place right now where I would argue, like a lot of people don't know what their preferences are. They don't actually understand what the objective is, right? And they haven't taken a look at it for a long time, or the objective, even business objectives, has changed over time. We work in lending and funding businesses, and I can tell you the number of times I see customers use AI to make an argument about what they think their financing should be, and I'm like, what you're doing is like, it's not actually the best for you, but I don't even have the opportunity to explain it to you because AI has removed the friction where people can come and interject, right? And so people have jumped to conclusions and said, no, like this is telling me that this is the best thing for what I believe to be. And you're like, actually, it's not, but you've iterated it so quickly and you kind of believe in all the things that this thing is telling you when you don't really understand what it is that you want. And so we see this in market research a lot, right? Where like we're in an age where a lot of market research is based on what customers want, but Steve Jobs very famously had, built entire trillion market cap companies, not what on customers are telling them. And so we are in this really awkward teenage phase, in my opinion, where we're trying to like work with agents and they can represent these digital twins of who we are. But most people don't have the best understanding of what it is that they want. Most businesses don't have the best understanding of what objectives they're trying to achieve. And that level of clarity has to come first before you can deploy AI agents to best serve your needs. Otherwise, the risk level is really high when you have automation and no checks and balances.
I mean, that is putting the work in ahead of time. Understand your workflow, understand the process that you're trying to automate before, because that does need to be modified as you go forward. That makes a lot of sense. You made the point that generative AI doesn't have a mental model, that creates problems for business people when they assume it does, right? Because as a human, that I think of a mental model, but it's not. It doesn't work the same. So we tend to project human intelligence on machines instead of trying to have understanding of how machines actually process and think. Right? How do you help people understand that at Credibly, and how do you help them set the right expectations?
Yeah, I give people some very concrete examples that they can see for themselves so that they understand that you have to remember working with these tools that they don't have a mental model, right? There's a really famous experiment where you tell them like, hey, if you give them the form, if you ask AI to answer a question where it translates, Celsius to Fahrenheit, if it's in its training data, it's going to get that math equation right. If you change the denominator of one of the questions, it's going to start getting it wrong. The higher probability of getting it wrong is much, much higher. If you make it so that the temperature you're trying to translate between the two measures is not a temperature found on Earth, but a temperature found on, say, Venus, it could also get it wrong. There's very famous, very simple things. To date, I haven't experimented this, but I know on GPT even 5, this was true. It's still very hard to generate a picture of someone who is left-handed because it's so sparse in the training data. Those are very obvious examples, but really what I try to train my people to understand is that what it doesn't have is it doesn't have what I call like the adjacency of expertise, right? Where with humans, it's like our intelligence is that we generalize in a way where when you become proficient at something, you are also equally proficient in the thing that's right next to it, and you can easily extrapolate. And this comes through even if you have young kids, you can experiment this with young kids, right? It's like once they understand how to do like math or like 2-digit math or like multiplication, you can kind of give them varied problems and they can quickly grasp onto it and learn, and they can jump and generalize from one to the other. AI can get extremely good as an expert in one sort of vertical, and you move 2 steps over and it will make mistakes that you're like, there's no way a 5-year-old can make these types of mistakes. And it will hallucinate, it'll create things. So it's not that it's more wrong, because I think if you take a benchmark of saying like humans versus AI will probably be more accurate more time, especially when you're talking about humanity's last exam and these like esoteric tests. But it's that when it's wrong in ways that are so incredibly unpredictable to humans that we can't wrap our minds around it. So what I teach my staff is to say, it's not about mental model like you, not like you. It's really about, do you understand the risks of what you're doing, right? Risk assessment is now a core skill set for anyone that has to work with AI. And I told my managers, like, now your job is you have to assess risk for your domain. Things you never had to think about before because legal told you it was doable or not doable. And a lot of companies are still using that as a main control mechanism. And I would advocate that that's not the right way to work with AI. But every person in a company now has to really think about their domain of expertise as, what are the risks associated with it? And then how do you as a manager understand where these risks can be mitigated with AI or completely ignored because it's not that risky? Or where are these risks? Even if you think you have a really good use case for AI, the risk of it being wrong is high enough that you're always going to want some sort of human oversight. I think once an organization can understand that risk is now going to be a fundamental dimension of their business decisions, no matter who you are, even if you're not in the risk business, that's going to help them understand how to work with AI.
Yeah, I've been talking lately a lot about, we've talked about human in the loop for a while, but if you have to scale that gets to be really complicated. It works well if it's a small pilot, but I think human in the lead actually makes more sense to my mind when I explain it, right? I want humans to set the goal, to be there, to be involved, but they don't have to approve every little action once you build that layer of trust.
Yep.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I know you launched Credibly AI recently to showcase the production Gen AI uses in fintech, and the company recently got a U.S. patent for a proprietary AI underwriting system that uses generative AI with multiple trained neural networks. Can you talk a bit about that technology? What does it do? How has it changed underwriting from a traditionally very manual process to something that's a lot more accurate and faster?
Yeah. And I think we started on this years ago. So this was when, literally it takes like 3 years to get a patent. So I don't think that the technology is as like amazing now as when we were first working with it. But basically, I think a lot of companies jumped into RAG, retrieval augmented generation, which is what we did as well. But the thing that we did is essentially be able to come up with a system of search internally that combines automation, inputs, rules, as well as like AI generated summaries and things to help better understand the profile of the business. When we first started, it was via the industry categorization. So most companies in our space use the Nexus codes from the government to be able to categorize industries, right? So now there's a lot of ways for you to automate about approximately what an industry a business is in, because it has to do with how risky that business is and the margins of that business. So we have to find information on an applicant and help figure out, are they in the business that they say they're in? So that's a combination of like web presence, third-party files, and your own internal data, et cetera. What we have found is that most companies are going offshore, having people manually research it or do some sort of very fuzzy matching. But none of these things are risk adjusted. So we developed our internal proprietary risk sectors, and then we use AI. To create essentially a layer that allows us to go find information and automatically create majority vote, what types of industry could this business be in, and then orchestrate it so that over time, identifying the industry is only one piece of input into underwriting, right? So over time, it's going to do also, we started other models where it's looking at licenses, it's looking at web presence. And so this becomes more of a systematic approach. And the latest innovation we're working on, which is a continuation of this technology, is pricing, agentic pricing, which then allows us to use automation to answer certain questions about the business that underwriters had been answering before, allowing the underwriters to work and use their expertise, validate the inputs, so that we're only really shifting the truly, I would say, the complex answers to humans for review, because they're going to require a lot more due diligence. And that's the kind of innovation where I think, like, when you look at system level change and using generative AI, we did it, don't get me wrong, but we're cobbling models together. We're going backwards to be like, oh, we need to now re-update these things. And it is not easy, right? Because there's also humans involved that have to validate inputs. It's literally the risk side is very important. And there's, on the other end of the spectrum, there's a lot of like fully automated credit AI underwriting practices, which again, in a vacuum, I think that looks great, except you don't have proprietary data, you don't have performance data, you don't have all the fraud things that we know is prevalent in a lot of financial services. And so existing in a vacuum, it can be 100% automated, might not lead to the best outcomes. And so being able to build it within an existing system is going to be slower, but you're making use of the knowledge base that you have from years and years of manual underwriting, which you've accumulated good senses around truly understanding risk. The bad side, obviously, is like, again, all of that data, all of the rules and all the things that not just us, but other people have built has been constrained by what the human mind can possibly understand. So those data structures are not super fleshed out for AI to do its best work on. So.
Interesting. Because I mean, it is the capability of AI then to process a much larger data set and much more real-time data to put together more of a complete picture to help you evaluate the risk. I mean, that's really interesting, and certainly plays on the strengths from both the human and the machine.
Yeah. But I think the dimensions here are really interesting, because we have, as a lender and as someone that is in this business, there is responsibility around explainability and trust, right? So you can argue that there's a world where, your database, you just let an LLM run wild and kind of figure out like, oh, here's kind of what I would do, here's what I wouldn't do. Okay, but like, how would you explain that? How would you explain that to somebody else to say, this is why we think your business deserves $500,000, $1 million, or why we think it doesn't, right? If AI is going to run its own algorithm and for every business gets down to a very specific deal level type of mathematical formula, the complexity makes it harder for us to be able to then satisfy that customer facing expectation. And this is why I see a lot of tensions where AI is really good at generating complexity and volume, right? Even in coding, it's really good at that. It's got high level, but it meets against real constraints of like, how much information can a human actually accept and digest and understand with a certain level of clarity? Can you satisfy customer trust and expectations, even if you're really precise, but you can't explain what you're doing because it's a black box? So these are tensions that businesses have to face, because again, AI doesn't operate on the scarcity model. That's what makes it so good at brainstorming and data analysis and giving you all kinds of different ideas. But the scarcity model is what most humans and most businesses are built around, which is like, with constrained resources, these are our most optimized set of outputs. Once you don't have those constrained resources, your optimized set of outputs change, but your customer expectations haven't changed, nor has laws changed with you. And so that's why I think it gets really interesting the next few years.
Yeah. I know you mentioned before that you've taken, a lot of advanced courses on AI governance, trust, business model transformation, and we were talking a little bit at the beginning about the true challenge lies in managing, the transition in new technologies. When you look at the change management side of AI adoption at Credibly, what worked for you and what surprised you? And now, if you could start over, what would you do differently?
Yeah, that's a great question because it's been such a messy and rewarding journey. And I wish I could tell people like I have this template where like if you just follow this template, everything's gonna be great. And like I'm still figuring it out. So what has
Mm,
worked for me is I think the Ethan Mollick's framework, and I do believe every company needs to have this of the crowd, the
mm,
lab, and the leader, right? So building the culture, building individuals who are excited about AI, making sure people are not super afraid of it,
mm.
giving people leeway to work with the frontier models, not the weaker models on Copilot or some of the more
Right.
degraded models. That is really necessary to just build foundational interest. And then, so that's your crowd. Your lab is your enterprise level efforts where you're still shipping things, you're still on your release cycle. You
Mm,
probably have cross functional teams, everything is behind APIs, you're coding, you're reviewing code, and you're picking really high value business cases, most of which have to be in experimental mode. Some of them are going to be in true, like, let's change and let's make some small projects, let's have some big bets. You need to have a breadth so that you're not constrained to only have moonshots or we only have sidecar
mm,
projects, and understand that there's going to be experimentation and failure, and that your ROI is not just necessarily in terms of dollars but in terms of how your work has changed. Then the leadership aspect is having a strategy, a top-down strategy that needs to get revisited once every 6 months. I'm about to lead another session on
mm,
starting from the bottom and then eventually reaching some version of AI mandate once you have enough people on board, right? Truly becoming an AI first organization and putting the onus on the
mm,
leadership, not just on the middle management. Having said that, I think the compatibility of how these three, I'll call it necessary components work, the speed at which they work, the fact that they're all tapping on the same people, I have found that to be very challenging. What I have
mm,
seen is that like when one part accelerates, the other part is just struggling to catch behind. We have great individual use cases. We have a generation of AI champions who's building stuff. And then the strategy side is like, I'm playing catch up. Also, a lot of times in these three components, it's the same group of people. And so you have your early adopters, you have people who are very, very good at what they do and are tenacious and curious, and they're being pulled into running the crowd and doing the lab, and they're part of executive leadership. So at the end of the day, like you're just constrained on like, okay, these are the same people who are managing all the important projects in the company, and they're either going to burn out or something's
yeah.
going to have to happen, right? So we're in the process of thinking about how do we restructure and reorg so that we can free up some of these people's time. Those are the things that I think if
Mm,
I were to go back, I would recognize that even though the first priority is every organization should establish these three components, how they work together is it's anyone's call. And also recognize that most likely your best minds are going to be in all three of them. So you have to figure
mm.
out how do you backfill and free up their time so they can be that horizontal backbone that then sort of creates that energy through the organization. And we're a smaller company. For big companies, good
Yeah.
luck because I don't know. This problem just gets amplified even more. So.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. I mean, it does come back to the in change management that bringing humans along in whatever way is just hard. It takes a lot of intentional work to get there. That one of the analogies you used with me when we were talking before was this idea of the balloon effect when it comes to AI. You squeeze on one end of the balloon and the other end pops out. And I think you used developers as an example. They gain productivity from AI generated code, but then they're reviewing expert level code at massive scale, so they don't have time to mentor junior developers. I mean, what kind of balloon effects are you seeing, and how should leaders prepare for them?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that's also a growing pain of using AI. I run marketing and sales, and I would tell you
Mm,
that with AI, some things become easier, but some things become infinitely more complex because, again, the tension between that scarcity model and that sort of like abundance model, which AI
mm,
is very good at, right? So, Great example in marketing. Any marketing podcast you listen to, any expert will tell you, how has marketing changed? Well, AI is fundamentally changing search, and AI is fundamentally, yes. What does that mean for marketing teams? It just means you have to do more. It doesn't mean you stop anything of what you're doing, because it doesn't fundamentally displace anything. It just says, well, now that we're going to show up in LLM search results, so you gotta make sure that you're now optimized for AEO instead of SEO, but you still have to do SEO, because LLMs find your results through SEO. So don't give up on those things, right? And so it's like all of a sudden you're like, okay, I'm using the same number of people, the same number of resources, but now I have to do more. So even if you're creating content faster and you're creating more relevant content faster, all of a sudden you also now you have to respond. Like, you can imagine a social media manager who is putting out videos and content faster, but that means you have to engage with the community at a much faster clip. Right. And so there's so many AI tools that can help increase productivity but increased productivity also means that there's more volume for the same amount of time. So marketing ends up having to do more. I've seen sales cycles take longer because now people are looking at that, using AI to help each other and support each other and make persuasive arguments. Customers are doing it, sales side is doing it, and so you just end up again doing more. And so we're going to hit a point where either things are going to become automated agents talking to automated agents, or we're going to have to find a way to kind of cut through a lot of the clutter, because this idea of building volume but not necessarily having a great standard for quality yet is something that every function has to deal with. And so once you can define what is high quality for your function, for your workflow, for your organization, then AI can help get you there, right? But a lot of it that's why I think there's this like AI slop that's going on, which is like, oh, you can just generate a PowerPoint. You can just make these beautiful executive presentations. Like, except you still have to work with it. You have to think through that. So now there's shortened time to do the same thing with the support of AI. But I think people misunderstand that, like, there's different kinds of work that's being created. Sometimes it's work that's less interesting. Sometimes it's work that's less value added, because the value added work is being taken up inappropriately by your AI assistant or AI tools. And you just end up doing more, but it may not be more satisfying or better work for the individual.
Yeah, that's I mean, it is very complicated to figure out the way that human AI collaboration works, and balance things so that you are getting the best out of both sides of it versus pushing the balloon in one direction and getting a pop out on the other. I guess that's, I mentioned this before, but I've been thinking a lot about this and wrote some things about it lately, about human in the loop to human on the loop to now human in the lead. And it seems like when we talked before, you've been living this credibly as you deployed AI. I mean, what do you think those phases look like in practice, and where are you guys on the journey now?
Yeah, I think the journey changes, because I also think, so there's two things in my mind. One is that you will have some tasks and things that are squarely in the human, in the loop, on the loop, or in the lead. And then there's also a possibility where the same task, as the frontier models expand and the organization becomes more mature, it changes, right? It goes from first we have to have humans in the loop, and then over time it's like, oh no, we can have humans on the loop, and eventually humans in a lead. So there's two ways that this can happen. So when we first started working with generative AI, and I'll take the agentic pricing stuff, that's like sort of right now we're working through it, and we're having AI assistants work with the underwriters to help them understand the risks of a deal. Right now it's very much humans in the loop. They have to look at it, they have to understand the outputs that AI is working through. They have to validate it. They have to go and say, would you make the same decision? Do you agree with it? Same thing we did. We were able to increase QA QC, so quality checks, by QAing more, because now with an LLM assisting, we can now QA more, right? So we can improve our quality. So those are kind of things that I think are very much human in the loop. Now, over time, though, those are going to start to morph, because as we get more data and feedback, we can now do the thing that we're saying, okay, the model is fairly confident that this is going to be a very high match. So we're going to take these away from human review. And whatever risk that's associated with it is either low enough or we think we can sustain it. So now we're going to be able to say, hey, when the model is below a certain threshold of confidence, that's when humans really get involved and start to give their expertise. So they're looking at the most difficult cases, or the cases that are the most opaque and don't have information. So then that allows us to do more. Separately, you can also imagine a future where now we get to a point where there's so much information and there's a very high level of comfort where the leadership is simply saying, we're just going to give direction on how we want this to go. Right? Probably not in the underwriting case, but in some other projects, like I would say like on the strategy side in terms of like tech, you can imagine like tech reviews being, hey, we think that we can get to a point where this kind of code or these types of fixes or these types of reviews can be fairly automated. And we're only deploying people to look at the more complex use cases. And so that's where I think where we are on the journey. I think right now, we are very much still in the first two phases. And I think we as a company, and also I would argue personally, are sort of backwards stumbling into a strategy. But I would hope that as like time continues, that we have a firmer grasp on what that strategy should be. And I say this to be very transparent and honest, because I think, I don't want to come on this podcast and be like, I have strategy for AI figured out and I know exactly what we're going to do and it's going to be a system and it's going to be great. I just don't believe that's true. Yeah. And I believe that, like, from my personal experience, the best you can do is sort of live with the chaos a little bit, be a little bit messy, and then sort of iterate and adapt as fast as you can while keeping an eye out for a strategic sort of telescoping, but then know that you have to change once every 6 months. I truly don't know of anything that I can do better than that, because I think the level of expertise in figuring things out and then being able to hold to a long-term strategy when so much change is happening and we're still learning is insincere when people say they have things figured out. If you do, please like email me, because I would love to learn from you, but I do not have it all figured out.
Yeah. And if you are, send me an email and let's get you on the show, because I'd love to have that that would be a great one, right?
I would love to hear that. Yes.
Yeah. And I mean, I've talked a lot about this idea that progression is trust, but it's not like some big picture thing, right? It's trust in each step and each process as a part of that step. So like you could be in human in the lead somewhere and human in the loop on a different thing, and that's not wrong. It's just where you are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
You mentioned commerce before, and I wrote something late last year on commerce and how that was starting to be impacted. And that's interesting. You think about, buying a human to an agent or an agent to a human. I mean, that's, that I can see that pretty easily. But then when you move to humans, away from humans to agents on both sides of the transaction, I mean, we don't understand that at all yet, right? I mean, we know human make purchasing decisions, but there's like not a lot of research around how agents are going to behave. I mean, how should businesses prepare for that when your buyer and your seller may be an AI agent?
Yeah, I think that that's certainly the trillion-dollar question going forward, and you can use whatever I would say lesson you want to learn from Mobbook is a great example of like what happens when agents kind of run wild and there's a lack of certainty around what's human, what's agents. But I would say that businesses, and right now what we can do, right, is make sure that your KYC, your know your customer. Can you think about a world where it's a KYA? How would you identity certify, make sure that you understand that this is a trusted representation of human? I think a lot of banks and financial services are already trying to work through that. So taking advantage of what that looks like, because eventually you have to authenticate an agent, not a person. So how do we do that, right? Like, how do I authenticate this virtual thing that's a representation of a real person? Do I always have the real person be involved as part of the experience or not? We don't know. So that's one thing. The other thing is, I think, preparing your website and your customer-facing materials to obviously make them, AI crawler, whatever, as friendly as possible. Right. But looking at it from the point of view of like, how would an agent interact with this? And this is where I think the concept of building out digital twins to then have them work, go through your entire like site and kind of ask LLMs, like, how would a digital sort of copy or clone of a person with no preferences interact with your business or the product you have to offer? So for example, we have an offer calculator, right? So we have a calculator that we send to our customers where they can look at different types of options. And obviously there's a certain level of complexity that we allow in that calculator because no human wants to look at a table with 70,000 rows. Okay, so how would you redesign that if the person looking at it is now a machine? Would you give them more options? Would you give them fewer options? Would you make the math really explicit and allow them to come up with their own combination, just at the constraints, and say like, no, you go create this product that you want. As long as it fits within these constraints, you can make it what happen, right? Like, I'm not even going to give you a calculator. I'm just going to give you a bunch of rules, and you tell me the one that you want. Designing it that way, and I'm literally spitballing here, but because that's what I imagine when I serve up a calculator with just a few decrements, because I'm trying to serve it to the human eye versus the computer vision, and then interacting with an agent that's optimized for something else. Would you design that tool differently? And I think most companies would probably say, yeah, we would probably design that differently for a fully autonomous agent than for a human.
Yeah, that's going to be an interesting one this year, I think, as more and more people talk about this too. We talked a lot about what leaders should be doing and even some of the risk, right? But I mean, if you were going to give advice to the listeners, what's the one thing you think leaders should not be doing when it comes to AI?
Yeah. I have super strong feelings about this because I see it with my own kids. I see it with the learning model and business in general, which is a leader has to decide, where do you want friction to exist? And I know this is such an interesting concept because tech is all about making things seamless and no friction. And the problem is that's not always good. Right? It's not necessarily good from a moral, philosophical perspective. It's not necessarily good from a learning or dependency perspective, but it may also not be good from a business perspective. If you allow AI to fully take away all of the friction because you think it's going to make things better, you may end up with worse employees, worse customers, worse retention, and probably less profitability. And so this is where we've seen, and there are good lessons in this, right? This is not a new idea. Right. We have seen a lot of times when like things that are fully automated just failed because people didn't really understand what the objectives were. They didn't understand what the liabilities were. And all of a sudden, like the macro environment changes and boom, like you're out of business. And I often have people tell me like, well, why can't just you guys deploy all these autonomous things and do this? And I tell people, have you never had a tech outage? Because if you have had a tech outage, you know how problematic things are. And we live in a world where there's going to be more and more tech outages. And so if you're not building in a way where you're building in some level of friction, where you're allowing talent to still know how to do things the old school way, or thinking really deeply about what can I possibly offload to AI to reduce all friction? And what kind of friction do I need to keep in-house, train people on, and maintain as part of the business so that I don't completely fail when something like a black swan event happens? Leaders have to really think about that, because I think the predominant thinking is just make it easy for everything and we will just ride this wave. And I think like when you give up that control to AI or to tech, it's the same thing as saying like, I don't need to teach my kids anymore because they'll just learn from all these things and it will be fine because it's going to be easy. And you're not going to produce very good kids. You will produce maybe kids who know how to use AI, but are incredibly not resilient, don't actually retain anything, and don't learn, right? And at the end of the day, that's not a healthy individual in the long run. And so I would encourage leaders to think about their businesses the same way, right? You want to make sure your business is healthy for the long run, and friction is necessary to maintain some of that.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Well, so we're getting to the end of our time allotted today, but great conversation. And honestly, I could keep going, but I suspect we'd lose some listeners at some point. So before I let you go, one thing I always like to ask at the end of the episode is, can you recommend somebody for the audience to check out? Somebody, a thought leader, author, blogger, podcaster, whatever you think would be really useful for the audience to check out.
Yeah, I think that so I've been taking classes with this professor. I'm actually close to a fair number of Wharton professors, but Stefano Pantoni is really good on looking at the human dimension and in marketing. There was a piece that he wrote recently in the Harvard Business Review that talks about AI's change in marketing, and I think that's a really just follow him and the things he says on the management perspective. The other thing that I know my product person listens to is called Lenny's newsletter, which is a product podcast, but they often feature a lot of really good AI specific topics. And the one that I really liked was the one on SEO and how AEO is going to change that. So those are also good resources. I unfortunately, I wish I were more of an expert in sort of like recommending all these things, but those are things I've had personal experiences with.
I mean, honestly, I think that's the most useful, right? It's the thing that's mattered from your perspective, helps people find really useful information. So I appreciate it. That's great. Well, MJ, thanks so much for joining today. Really, really interesting conversation.
Thank you. I so enjoyed being here and I appreciate the back and forth.
And that's the show for this week. Thank you all for joining us. Remember to like, share, and subscribe to the show. If you enjoy the show, please leave us a review to help others find us. For more research on AI and other software, check out arianresearch.com. If you're an expert in AI, generative AI, or business automation, either as a provider or an end user, email your information to disambiguation@arianresearch.com. Don't forget to join us next week. Disambiguation is an Arian Research production. I'm Michael Fauscette, and this is the Disambiguation Podcast.